Have you ever stood before an old building and felt something you couldn't explain? A strange familiarity, a quiet pull, a sense that the stones themselves remember something long forgotten? This is the story of Tartaria, a civilization erased from our history books, but not from the world itself. Its name has vanished from maps, its buildings repurposed, buried, or destroyed, its energy silenced. And yet, its presence still lingers in the curves of ancient architecture, in the hum beneath old streets, in the quiet questions that refuse to go away. Tonight, we will take a journey, a slow, deep remembering, not just of places, but of patterns, not just of cities, but of consciousness. Settle in. Let the noise fade. We are about to explore the entire story of Tartaria, the empire erased from history, not as tourists in the past, but as witnesses returning home. In the quiet folds of time, hidden within forgotten maps and the dusty corners of ancient libraries, a whisper lingers, a name that echoes through the cracks of history: Tartaria. A strange word, mystical, almost ghostly. Tartaria is not merely the name of a lost land, but a symbol of something larger, something that once may have been, or perhaps never was. Legend or truth, myth or forgotten reality. There is no simple answer, but one thing is certain. The world we know today is shaped with gaps. And within those gaps lies the shadow of a civilization some claim was deliberately erased. On old maps from the 16th and 17th centuries, the name Tartaria sprawls across vast territories of the Eurasian continent, stretching from the borders of Eastern Europe all the way to distant Siberia and the Pacific. In these depictions, Tartaria isn't drawn as a marginal land, but as a massive empire of almost superhuman size. Some maps call it Great Tartaria, others break it into Tartarian kingdoms. Yet the common theme among them is enormity and mystery, as if the cartographers knew something was there, but couldn't quite say what. Travelers and early explorers occasionally spoke of the Tartars, a people of uncertain origin, said to possess sophisticated architecture, advanced technology, and knowledge that seemed far beyond their time. And yet, as the centuries passed, the name Tartaria slowly disappeared from textbooks and atlases, replaced by new labels: the Russian Empire, China, Mongolia, as if someone had systematically redrawn the historical map. What once may have been one vast civilization became fragmented into national identities, and the memory of Tartaria faded. But traces remain: ancient documents, curious architecture, archaeological finds that don't fit the accepted historical narrative. One of the strangest elements in this puzzle is the idea of the mud flood, a theory tied directly to Tartaria. According to this idea, great portions of the world once suffered a cataclysm that buried entire cities, civilizations, and with them, the knowledge of their existence. Old photographs show buildings with doors and windows half buried in soil, entrances that now open below street level, all hinting at a kind of global reset that mainstream history never mentions. Theories about Tartaria gained new life in the digital age, as the internet enabled curious minds to share images, maps, and observations that challenged the status quo. People began asking, why is Tartaria rarely, if ever, taught in schools? Why were maps featuring its name withdrawn from usage? Why were so many old buildings destroyed or heavily altered during specific historical periods? And then come the claims that border on science fiction, tales of free energy, resonant towers, advanced medicine, all said to be remnants of Tartarian knowledge, erased to make room for a different version of history. Do we imagine Tartaria as a lost world, like Atlantis? Or did it truly exist and serve as the foundation for the knowledge we now attribute to later empires? Could it be that our schools, encyclopedias, and museums simply chose to ignore its existence, or were made to forget? And who would have the power or motive to do such a thing? This is not just a story about a lost empire. It is a story about us, about how much we trust the official history, and how far we're willing to look beyond it. Tartaria is more than a place. It is a symbol of the unspoken, the unacknowledged, the forgotten. So when we ask if it's possible for an entire empire to vanish from humanity's collective memory, maybe it's time to reopen the forgotten maps, to search the records penned by forgotten hands, to wonder why some paths lead to nowhere, and why so many questions have no official answers. At the heart of this tale is not just a land or a people, but what remains when truth becomes a matter of perspective, and when knowledge becomes privilege instead of a right. Tartaria whispers to us from the shadows of archives, through faded frescoes, brittle maps, and the silent streets of cities no one remembers building. At the center of many Tartarian theories are the astounding buildings, structures that still stand across the world, but whose origins, creators, and construction methods remain unclear. Old castles, domed palaces, towers, cathedrals with massive arches, crafted with such precision and symmetry that modern engineers are left puzzled. Why do we see the same architectural patterns in Moscow, San Francisco, Istanbul, Beijing, and St. Louis? How could cities on opposite ends of the earth display buildings that seem to come from the same culture? Tartarian theorists argue that these buildings were not the result of European colonization or Russian expansion, but remnants of a once unified and advanced civilization, one that spanned continents and understood technology in ways we've forgotten. Some point to the strange shapes of towers and spires on these buildings, suggesting they were not decorative, but functional, part of a network that produced free energy, energy from the ether, from the air itself, as Nikola Tesla once described. In fact, Tesla is often linked to this lost knowledge, viewed as a possible inheritor of ancient wisdom rediscovered too late. A major focal point in this mystery lies in the world's fairs of the 19th and early 20th centuries. In cities like Chicago, Paris, San Francisco, and Philadelphia, immense exhibitions were built, entire fairgrounds of breathtaking architecture that looked like scenes from another world. Officially, we are told these structures were temporary, made of plaster and wood, but photographs tell a different story. Stone facades, intricate carvings, towering domes. How could something so massive and detailed be built in mere months without modern technology? And why were most of them torn down shortly after the fairs ended? Some believe the world's fairs were not celebrations of modern achievement, but cover-ups, a way to introduce old Tartarian structures as new creations, masking their true origins. In this light, the destruction of these buildings wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, a way to erase evidence, to rewrite the narrative. The same idea underlies the mud flood theory, that some great event, whether natural or engineered, buried cities worldwide, leaving only rooftops and upper floors above ground. As excavation followed, buildings were uncovered, with doorways and windows far below current street levels, as if a century of history was simply skipped. Symmetrical architecture, alignment with magnetic poles, acoustic resonance in stone halls. These elements hint at knowledge not just of design, but of energy and frequency. Tartaria begins to look like a civilization that understood vibration, sound, and sacred geometry in ways that challenge everything we think we know. A society that may have tapped into a different level of interaction with the physical world. But how could something so vast and advanced simply vanish from history? It's said that history is written by the victors. And if that's true, then the story of Tartaria may have been erased not by accident, but by intention. Removal of maps, destruction of records, rewriting textbooks, silencing dissent. All these actions can eliminate a memory in just a few generations. In a world where knowledge is centralized and controlled by institutions, it isn't hard to imagine entire truths being buried under layers of silence. And perhaps that's what makes Tartaria so compelling, its absence. The fact that it's not in the curriculum, not in the museums, not on the lips of historians. That silence invites investigation. Each map showing Tartaria, each explorer's journal that names it, every old photo showing strange buried buildings. They all become puzzle pieces, and each one raises new questions. Each one adds to a picture that no one officially acknowledges. If we begin to accept that history is not a fixed record, but a story shaped by power and intention, then the rediscovery of Tartaria becomes more than curiosity. It becomes a reclamation, a quest to find a lost part of humanity's story. The further we dive into the enigma of Tartaria, the more we begin to question not just what we've been told about history, but how we even define a civilization. What if Tartaria was not just a nation with borders and armies, but a global cultural web, a unifying presence that linked faraway lands with a shared architecture, technology, and worldview? The idea seems impossible to many, and yet the patterns keep emerging. Consider the rail systems, the electric streetcars, the vast networks of transportation that appeared simultaneously in multiple cities during the 1800s. The official narrative says these were marvels of the Industrial Revolution, but some researchers note how advanced and ready-made they seemed, as if they were uncovered rather than built from scratch. What if Tartarian cities already had this infrastructure, and the societies that came after simply restored them or rebranded them? Old photographs show elaborate train stations, grand civic buildings, domed courthouses, and immense cathedrals built in record time, with techniques that even modern architects find baffling. How were such massive stone structures constructed without cranes, trucks, or reinforced concrete? And why do they all share similar stylistic elements regardless of geography? Columns, domes, massive entrances, geometrical alignment? It's almost as if these cities were part of a master blueprint, laid out according to principles that have since been lost or suppressed. Even more curious are the subterranean levels of these buildings. Entire floors buried beneath the current street level, with windows, doors, and even signage, suggesting these were not basements, but once ground-level entries. This isn't an isolated phenomenon. It can be found in St. Petersburg, Paris, New York, Melbourne, and many other cities. These structures seem to have been dug out rather than built up, as if time and sediment had swallowed them, and later generations simply adjusted the surface rather than questioning what lay beneath. The mud flood theory ties directly into this, suggesting that a cataclysmic event or series of events covered much of the Earth's surface with thick layers of mud and soil. According to this idea, what we now walk upon may not be the original ground level, and many of the cities we live in may be built atop older, buried cities. This isn't entirely foreign to mainstream archaeology, which acknowledges multiple layers of settlement in ancient places like Troy, Rome, or Jerusalem. But what if that wasn't just the case for the ancient world? What if it applied to the modern world as well? And what if that buried layer belonged to Tartaria? The mechanics of such a flood remain unclear. Was it a natural disaster, like a worldwide liquefaction or sudden glacial melt? Or was it something engineered, a deliberate wiping of the slate? In either case, the outcome was the same, a global layer of silence that buried not only buildings but knowledge. And this knowledge, some believe, extended far beyond energy and construction. Tartaria is often associated with advanced forms of healing, with frequency-based medicine, sound therapy, even consciousness-altering technologies. The strange devices seen in old photographs, odd spires, rooftop fixtures, and tuning fork-like antennas, are thought by some to be remnants of this lost science, a science that didn't burn fuel or split atoms, but harmonized with nature. This perspective transforms Tartaria from a geopolitical mystery into a metaphysical one. It becomes not just a lost empire, but a lost way of being. A worldview rooted not in conquest, but in resonance, not in hierarchy, but in harmony. And perhaps that is the real reason it had to be erased. In a world increasingly driven by centralization, competition, and consumption, a culture based on balance and energetic connection may have been seen as a threat. To erase such a civilization would not just be an act of historical revisionism, but one of ideological replacement. And yet, pieces of it remain, in the form of silent buildings whose shapes speak in geometries we no longer understand, in the hidden maps that still label vast regions as Tartary, in the symbols carved into stone that seem to belong to no known language. People begin to wonder, could our own ancestors have walked these streets? Could our history be not just missing a chapter, but an entire volume? The truth, whatever it may be, lies not in the pronouncements of authority, but in the spaces between. In the things not taught, the images that feel out of place, the ruins that defy explanation, Tartaria calls to the part of us that remembers without knowing how, the intuitive part that feels the presence of something more, something deeper, just beneath the surface of what we've been told. When we explore Tartaria, we aren't just exploring a lost empire. We are venturing into the very fabric of how reality is framed. One of the most persistent questions is how a civilization of such alleged scale and influence could vanish so completely from the mainstream narrative. It's not just that Tartaria is excluded, it's that it is actively avoided. Encyclopedias of the early 20th century still listed Tartary as a geographical region. Children once learned about it in classrooms. Yet, at some point, the term was dropped altogether, as if by silent consensus. Why would an entire region be redacted from collective memory? This kind of erasure doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly, incrementally, through language, policy, and education. As new empires rise, they impose their version of history. New maps are printed, old documents discarded, and a fresh narrative is taught to each new generation. And with enough time, the original story is forgotten, not because it wasn't real, but because no one is left to remember it. Tartaria's disappearance fits this model disturbingly well. Its traces linger, not in history books, but in architectural anomalies, in dusty volumes of forgotten atlases, in the questions people are now just beginning to ask. Let's turn our attention to those buildings again, the ones with strange features that don't quite make sense. Many old world structures contain symbols from a wide range of spiritual and esoteric traditions. Geometrical shapes that mirror those found in ancient temples, cathedrals aligned with star constellations, floor plans that reflect sacred ratios like the golden mean or the Fibonacci spiral. Could these elements be clues left behind by a civilization that understood more about the metaphysical relationship between space, sound, light, and consciousness than we do today? Take the so-called star forts found across Europe, North America, and Asia. From above, they resemble complex geometric mandalas, perfectly symmetrical, built with uncanny precision. Official history tells us these were defensive structures built during various colonial periods, but their construction often predates the technology needed to build them. Many appear in remote locations, far from known battlefields, and with no clear military use. Some have underground tunnels and resonant chambers, leading some to speculate they were not fortresses, but energy centers. Perhaps remnants of a Tartarian grid, a planetary network that harnessed natural energy flows. There is also the mystery of the orphan trains. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, hundreds of thousands of children were relocated across North America, often without records of their origin. Some theorists suggest these were not orphans in the usual sense, but survivors, children of a population wiped out or scattered by a cataclysm, resettled into a new society that would never tell them where they truly came from. If this sounds far-fetched, consider how easily entire generations can be severed from their past. A child without a family becomes a blank slate, ready to be written upon by whatever culture takes them in. And so, the pieces begin to connect. Forgotten cities, buried doorways, star-shaped fortresses, lost children. erased maps, all suggest a hidden history woven beneath our own. A history that has been pushed down, covered over, left to rot beneath the soil in silence. Yet the very persistence of these elements proves that truth cannot be fully destroyed, only delayed. Tartaria may be buried, but it still breathes, in stone, in memory, in the quiet recognition that something about our world does not add up. The question is no longer whether Tartaria existed, but why its memory had to be suppressed. And if that memory is rising again now, if more people are beginning to ask, to see, to sense, then perhaps we are not just remembering Tartaria, perhaps we are awakening something far older within ourselves. As the fog of forgotten history lifts, the question turns inward. Not just, what was Tartaria? But, why were we not meant to know about it? It is one thing to forget, but another entirely to be made to forget. The erasure of Tartaria seems too coordinated, too complete, to be explained by accident or neglect. When vast regions of land are removed from maps, when a civilization disappears from textbooks overnight, when old books are revised, structures demolished, and documents redacted, we are no longer dealing with a passive loss of memory. We are confronting active suppression. Consider the concept of the reset, a term now widely associated with Tartaria. The idea is that history may not be linear, as we're taught, but cyclical, punctuated by resets, massive global events that wipe the slate clean. Some resets may have been natural earthquakes, floods, cosmic shifts, but others may have been engineered. War, disease, societal collapse. Each one an opportunity to rewrite the narrative. Tartaria may have been a victim of such a reset. Its knowledge scattered, its people assimilated, its legacy buried under a new world order. One of the most compelling aspects of this theory is how many anomalies it attempts to explain. Why are there photographs from the late 1800s and early 1900s showing entire cities with immense buildings but almost no people? Why do these cities look eerily empty, with pristine streets, towering monuments, and a strange lack of construction equipment? Why were so many of these grand buildings capable of housing thousands later demolished, abandoned, or repurposed without proper records of their origins? Some researchers suggest these cities were not built by the people who supposedly founded them, but inherited. They call them inheritor civilizations. Societies that moved into the ruins of the old world claimed them as their own and began telling a new story. The new story became official, and the old one, over time, was declared myth or forgotten entirely. And yet, the architecture remains, too grand for its time, too sophisticated for the technology that supposedly built it. Domed structures that echo the energy-collecting temples of the past. Ornate stonework with unknown symbols. Metal components that seem to resonate with a forgotten purpose. The more we examine these buildings, the more they seem to hint at a knowledge beyond aesthetics. Some Tartarian theorists suggest that these structures were tuned to frequencies, designed not just for shelter or ceremony, but for resonance. The domes, spires, columns, and large empty halls all functioned like parts of an instrument. Sound waves, electromagnetic pulses, Even human emotion may have been amplified and harmonized within these walls. Could it be that Tartaria knew how to live in alignment with the Earth's natural energy grids and used buildings not just to occupy space, but to conduct energy? Evidence of this can be seen in the layout of cities. Many Tartarian-linked cities show radial symmetry with central towers, circular roads, and geometric divisions. This is not simply urban planning, it's sacred geometry. It's the same principle found in ancient mandalas, in the patterns of nature, in the orbital paths of planets. Such precision suggests not just intelligence, but intention. A worldview where everything is connected, where architecture, energy, and consciousness form a unified system. But perhaps the most unsettling idea is that such a system was not simply forgotten, but dismantled, torn down brick by brick, theory by theory, until only the skeletons remained. And even those were renamed and misunderstood. In this light, the demolitions of the 20th century take on new meaning. It wasn't just about modernization or decay. It was about erasing the remnants of a different kind of world. One where energy was free, harmony was valued, and knowledge was shared. Today, people walk past these buildings every day, unaware of the deeper story they may carry. A courthouse, a library, a train station, all potentially ancient nodes of a vanished network. Covered in dust and stripped of meaning, they stand as silent witnesses to a time we're no longer allowed to remember. And yet, even in silence, they speak. The deeper the layers of Tartaria are uncovered, the more it becomes clear this is not just a forgotten chapter, but perhaps an entire alternate history. One that challenges everything we think we know about the evolution of civilization. The mystery of Tartaria is not confined to one region or one culture. It stretches across continents, hidden in plain sight, and it poses a terrifyingly simple question. What if our entire understanding of progress is built on a foundation of deliberate misdirection? Look at the maps again. Early depictions of the world, dating back to the 1500s and 1600s, show Tartaria occupying a massive swath of the globe. Its name appears prominently, stretching across Siberia, Central Asia, even into parts of North America. These were not vague markings. They were clear territorial labels used by respected cartographers of the time. Then, slowly, the name disappears. By the mid-19th century, Tartaria is gone from the maps, replaced by nation-states and imperial territories. The revision is complete. But why? Why would an entire continent-spanning empire be erased? Some believe the answer lies in control. If Tartaria possessed knowledge or technology that defied the centralized systems of power-free energy, healing frequencies, social models based on resonance rather than rule, then allowing its memory to survive would threaten the new order. Better to eliminate the competition, not through war, but through amnesia. Not by destroying every structure, but by destroying the context, the understanding of what those structures really were. There are echoes of this erasure in the way modern history is taught. A focus on linear progress, from primitive to advanced, from tribal to industrial. There is little room in this model for advanced ancient civilizations, for high technology in the distant past. or for empires that operated on principles foreign to the industrial mindset. Tartaria breaks that mold. It suggests a different kind of progress, one that values harmony over hierarchy, cooperation over conquest, frequency over force. This is why so many feel drawn to the Tartaria mystery. It resonates not just with conspiracy or curiosity, but with a deeper sense that something has been lost. A cultural inheritance, a collective memory, a forgotten way of seeing the world. People begin to notice the clues, the buried windows, the empty domes, the old photographs of cities with no inhabitants. They begin to ask, who really built all this? Where did the knowledge go? Why were we never told? There is also a spiritual dimension to the story, one that sees Tartaria not just as a civilization, but as a consciousness, a level of awareness that once permeated the earth, one of balance, intention, and sacred design. In this view, the fall of Tartaria was not just the end of a people, but a fall in human consciousness itself, a descent from connection into fragmentation, from knowing into forgetting. Yet perhaps that memory is not lost forever. Perhaps we are only now ready to remember. In the quiet moments, when we look at an old building and feel something stir, when we walk into a cathedral and hear the echoes of forgotten frequencies, when we question what we've always been told, perhaps then Tartaria speaks to us again. Not through words, but through resonance, through the feeling that there was once a different way to be human, and that we might find it again. One of the strangest and most overlooked clues pointing to the existence of Tartaria comes not from ancient ruins or secret texts, but from the skies, specifically from the odd, often inexplicable presence of towers, spires, and so-called antennas on countless old-world buildings. These ornate structures, frequently dismissed as decorative, appear on government buildings, cathedrals, mansions, and even public institutions. Many of them bear uncanny similarities to modern technologies used for signal transmission, and some theorists suggest they once played a critical role in a forgotten global energy system. Look closely at the architecture of these buildings, and patterns emerge. Copper domes, metal finials, long spires capped with spheres, sometimes all connected by metallic rods. These are not randomly placed. They are systematically arranged, aligned with the Earth's magnetic field, and often found in symmetrical clusters within cities. Tartarian researchers propose that these structures acted like ancient Tesla towers, drawing energy from the atmosphere or the Earth itself. In this model, cities were not just places to live. They were living organisms, energy hubs, vibrating with a frequency that nourished both body and soul. This kind of free, ambient energy, if it ever existed, would have been revolutionary. No wires, no combustion, no pollution, only a harmonization with the planet's natural forces. It is not difficult to imagine why such a technology, if real, would be suppressed. An energy source that cannot be metered or monopolized threatens every model of profit and control. If Tartaria once harnessed such a power, then its destruction would not be merely historical, it would be ideological. A cleansing of the old world to make room for one bound by scarcity and control. But the towers remain, and the evidence continues to grow. Photographs from the 1800s show devices on rooftops that resemble early radio or transmission equipment long before the accepted invention of such technologies. Reports from early travelers describe cities that glowed at night, illuminated by mysterious means. And many of the world's great exhibitions, those sudden, impossibly constructed cities of marble and glass, featured enormous, electrically lit buildings. At a time when much of the surrounding countryside had never seen a light bulb. Were these displays a celebration of modernity, or a display of inherited Tartarian technology, paraded briefly before being destroyed? Why were most of these grand structures demolished immediately after the fairs? Why were they built so fast and with such technical skill? Why is there so little detailed documentation about their construction? These are the questions that keep emerging. And the more they are asked, the more the answers lead to silence or contradiction. There is also the curious matter of water. Many Tartarian theorists point to the consistent presence of elaborate fountains, aqueducts, and water basins in cities linked to the lost civilization. Water, they argue, was not merely decorative or for sanitation, it was a vital component in their energy system. Flowing water, especially in conjunction with magnetism and resonant frequencies, could serve as a natural amplifier or conductor. Modern science has only begun to understand the complex relationship between water and energy, particularly at the molecular level. Perhaps Tartaria had already mastered it. If this sounds impossible, consider how many inventions in our own time have been dismissed, ridiculed, or outright buried. Technologies that threaten the status quo have often disappeared without a trace. If such things can happen now, in the era of global media and communication, how much easier would it have been in the 18th or 19th century? Before the internet, before citizen journalism, before anyone could truly question the narrative. Tartaria, then, may not only have been a land of extraordinary architecture and lost history, but also a civilization that understood the Earth in a fundamentally different way. One that saw the planet not as a resource to be mined, but as a living entity to be harmonized with. This worldview would shape everything: medicine, transportation, communication, even spiritual life. And that might be the most revolutionary idea of all. To grasp the full scale of the Tartarian enigma, one must look not only at what remains, but at what's been removed. Across the world, entire architectural styles seem to have vanished overnight. Structures that once defined cities, ornate train stations, courthouses, concert halls, have either been destroyed or stripped of their original meaning. In many cases, their history has been rewritten. A building from the 1600s is labeled as 19th century. A monumental structure is explained away as a product of a small group of underfunded workers. The timelines rarely add up, and yet the official explanations are repeated without question. This architectural amnesia extends to whole cities. Take, for example, the great fires that swept through numerous urban centers in the 19th century: Chicago, San Francisco, Boston, Toronto, Paris, and even cities in Australia and Asia. These weren't small blazes. They were citywide infernos, often described as moving too fast and burning too hot to be natural. Wooden buildings burned, yes, but so did stone. Brick melted, steel twisted, entire districts vanished, and in their place, new structures emerged, conveniently aligned with industrial modernity. Were these fires truly accidents, or were they the final step in erasing the old world, the last cleansing of Tartarian remnants, before a new architectural order could be imposed? In some cases, the rebuilding of cities after these fires happened so quickly, so completely, that many theorists argue they were not rebuilt at all, but uncovered, excavated, rebranded, as though the old buildings had always been there, just buried, altered, or hidden behind a new facade. Another anomaly that fuels this idea is the frequent discovery of massive underground networks beneath cities. Tunnels, basements, vaulted chambers, and entire lower levels that no one seems to have built. These spaces are often discovered during construction or renovation projects, and many show signs of previous use. What were they for? Why are they never mentioned in city plans? Were they once part of the original Tartarian infrastructure? Or perhaps sanctuaries during the mud flood? If our cities are built on the bones of another world, then perhaps we are all living atop a forgotten civilization without even knowing it. The idea becomes even more intriguing when we examine the cultural elements associated with Tartaria. Some claim that Tartarian society was not only technologically advanced, but also socially harmonious, guided by principles of unity, frequency, and shared knowledge. This stands in stark contrast to the hierarchical industrial systems that replaced it. If Tartaria existed as a decentralized, cooperative network where cities were self-sufficient and energy was shared freely, then the powers that followed would have had every reason to dismantle it, not just for land or resources, but to eliminate the idea that another way was possible. Language, too, may hold clues. Older dialects, symbols, even the shapes of letters and ancient inscriptions seem to share a common root across cultures supposedly separated by thousands of miles. Could it be that there was once a universal language, one that allowed for a deeper, energetic communication, a language not just of the mouth, but of form, vibration, and frequency? If so, then the suppression of Tartaria was not merely about buildings and borders, but about silencing a global voice. In the end, Tartaria remains elusive, not because it lacks evidence, but because the evidence does not fit neatly into any single box. It is everywhere and nowhere. It is in the architectural echoes of forgotten cities, in the magnetic pull of ancient towers, in the strange warmth of symbols that seem to remember what we've forgotten. And perhaps that is the most powerful truth of all, that something so thoroughly buried could still speak through stone, light, and silence. That beneath the noise of history, a deeper song continues to play, waiting for us to listen. The more we look, the more Tartaria begins to reveal itself not as an isolated mystery, but as a deeply embedded anomaly that stretches across time, geography, and even ideology. The mystery isn't confined to dusty ruins or fading mapset pulses in our cities, lingers in our language, and echoes through our collective amnesia. This is not just about an ancient empire. It is about the erasure of an entire worldview, one that, if rediscovered, could change how we see civilization itself. Take, for example, the concept of world fairs again. At first glance, these grand events seem to showcase the best of human achievementa, celebration of innovation, culture, and industry. But beneath their gleaming facades lie questions that refuse to be answered. How did 600-acre fairgrounds filled with palaces, domes, canals, and statues appear seemingly out of nowhere? Why were they allegedly built with plaster and chicken wire, yet appear in photos to be made of marble and stone? How were they constructed in just a year or two, using horse-drawn carts and hand tools, then demolished immediately after? The answers we are given strain belief, and the idea that these were rebranded remnants of Tartaria becomes harder to dismiss. The 1,893 Chicago World's Fair, known as the White Cities, one of the most famous examples. It included nearly 200 neoclassical buildings with massive columns, intricate domes, grand arches, and electric street lighting, all constructed, supposedly, in less than 2 years. Contemporary reports describe visitors marveling not just at the structures, but at how impossibly perfect everything felt. It was not just the grandeur, it was the atmosphere. A sense of being in a world not quite like our own. And then, shortly after the fair ended, most of it was destroyed by fire, by demolition, by design. This pattern repeats across many cities. In San Francisco, the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition followed the same script. Gigantic buildings rose rapidly, dazzled crowds with lights and fountains, then disappeared. Why construct monuments of such scale only to erase them? Why is the documentation of their construction so limited? And why do some of these buildings bear striking resemblance to ancient architecture found thousands of miles away? There's a feeling of déjà vu that lingers when comparing photographs from these fairs to the temples of Angkor Wat, or the plazas of Samarkand, or the courtyards of Florence, as if the same hand had drawn them all. Some researchers believe that these exhibitions were not celebrations of progress, but ceremonies of transition, a way to overwrite what came before, to take the surviving structures of Tartaria, dress them up as temporary marvels, and then remove them before people asked too many questions. In this interpretation, the fairs were less about innovation and more about ritual closing one age and beginning another. It's not just architecture. The more one studies historical timelines, the more it becomes clear that the 1800s were not merely a time of growth and expansion, but of rewriting. Events like the orphan train, migrations, mass resettlements, urban fires, and sudden technological discoveries all point to a massive reshaping of society. Were these orphans truly abandoned children, or were they survivors of a population that had been displaced, perhaps deliberately? Did they inherit a world that wasn't theirs, only to be taught a history that never mentioned their origins? There's a quiet tragedy in this possibility, that we may all be descendants of a world erased, that the modern age didn't build upon the past, it buried it, that we are walking through museums without realizing it, touching the bones of giants and calling them decoration. Yet it's also empowering, because if Tartaria really was a civilization of resonance, energy, and harmony, then it means those principles still exist. They were not destroyed, only hidden. And what is hidden can be remembered. Tartaria's fingerprints stretch further than most dare to imagine, not only across Eurasia, where its name once dominated maps, but into the Americas, Africa, Australia, even the Arctic. Its possible global scope challenges the very idea of separate, unconnected cultures evolving in isolation. Instead, a new picture begins to form of a unified architectural language, shared technologies, and synchronized development that defies conventional timelines. And if this picture is accurate, it would mean that Tartaria wasn't just a lost empire, was the original world order. Let's consider the architecture of certain cities that predate modern colonization yet display grand infrastructure, massive buildings, wide boulevards, star-shaped forts, and monumental domes. Many of these cities were allegedly built by settlers with minimal resources and crude tools, yet the design and symmetry rival anything from Imperial Rome or Renaissance Europe. Buenos Aires, Cape Town, Algiers, Jakarta, and even parts of Alaska all exhibit the same strange pattern. Cities appearing suddenly in remote locations, with no clear record of how their grandest structures were built. One could dismiss this as colonial ambition. But then why do so many of these buildings fall into immediate decay, abandonment, or outright destruction? Why were so many torn down or buried during the 20th century? And why do local histories so often contradict the grandeur of what remains? Official explanations feel increasingly shallow the more one examines the details. It's as if the buildings came first and the stories came later. There's also the matter of ancient technology that modern science struggles to replicate. Certain types of stonework, metal alloys, and construction techniques visible in old-world buildings seem to defy the materials and tools available at the time. Walls that remain perfectly plumb after hundreds of years. Columns carved from a single piece of stone. Domes that still carry sound as if they were built yesterday. These are not just anomalies, they are evidence of a civilization that may have reached a different technological apex, not based on digital microchips or fossil fuels, but on vibration, harmony, and natural energy flows. Even time itself seems to shift when studying Tartaria. The standard historical timeline begins to blur. Events once considered independent begin to align. A massive solar storm in 1859. The so-called Carrington event disrupted electronics worldwide and caused skies to glow across continents. Was this an isolated cosmic flare-up, or the last gasp of a failing Tartarian system, powered by atmospheric energy and sensitive to magnetic fluctuations? And what if other natural disasters were not so natural at all? Then there are the forgotten inventions, devices, and discoveries from the 1800s that appeared, amazed, and vanished. Technologies that created light without wires, vehicles that moved without fuel, even photographs of airships hovering over cities long before the Wright brothers took flight. Each one is treated as a curiosity, an outlier. But what if they were not inventions at all, but rediscoveries? Remnants of Tartaria that briefly resurfaced before being suppressed once again. This leads us to, perhaps, the most profound implication of all. If Tartaria once spanned the globe, and if its knowledge was real, then we are not merely dealing with a lost chapter, we are dealing with a forgotten blueprint, a template for a different kind of society, one that honored resonance, light, and the unseen forces of nature, one that aligned human life with planetary rhythms. one that did not seek to dominate, but to harmonize. Such a society would not need empires or corporations. It would not require scarcity or fear. It would simply exist, beautifully, freely, and in tune. And that may be why it had to be erased. As we continue to unravel the threads of Tartaria, it becomes evident that this is more than a mystery about a vanished empire. It's a confrontation with our own understanding of reality. Because if Tartaria existed, and the growing body of anomalies suggests it did, then we must also accept that we are living in the aftermath of a deliberate erasure. The physical remnants are still with us, woven into the infrastructure of our modern world, but the context, the meaning, has been stripped away. We walk through cities filled with Tartarian echoes without ever recognizing them as such. The process of erasure wasn't just physical demolition, it was psychological reconstruction. Through school books, museum exhibits, and mass media, we've been conditioned to see history as a straight line, a neat progression from primitive to advanced, from ignorance to enlightenment. This story leaves no room for sudden regressions, or for civilizations that may have been more advanced in certain respects than we are today. Tartaria disrupts that story. It suggests that humanity might have once been more spiritually, architecturally, and energetically aligned with the Earth Hand, that such alignment was systematically dismantled. This leads to the difficult question: who would do this? Who would gain from hiding Tartaria? Theories vary, but most point toward emerging power structures in the post-Enlightenment era empires, financial elites, secret societies that sought control not just of land and people, but of knowledge itself. In such a world, the existence of a decentralized, energy-rich civilization that defied ownership would be an existential threat. The new world needed new rules, and the old world had to be forgotten. But the forgetting was never perfect. Look closely at old encyclopedias printed before 1900, and you'll still find entries for Tartary. You'll read about vast territories, a variety of Tartarian peoples, and cities with strange names and unknown origins. Yet even within these sources, a subtle shift begins to occur. The language changes. What was once described with respect becomes ridiculed. The tone shifts from curiosity to dismissal. Tartary is rebranded not as a civilization, but as a vague term for uncivilized nomads. The act of historical sabotage isn't loud, it's quiet. A change of terminology, a redefinition, a whisper turned into a joke. And what about the people? Where did they go? Were they absorbed into emerging nations, forced to adopt new identities? Or did they simply disappear into history's silence? The populations associated with Tartaria, Turkic tribes, Siberian peoples, Central Asian groups have rich oral histories filled with stories of golden cities, sky gods, and sacred knowledge. These aren't fairy tales, they're echoes, fragments of a memory that refuse to die. The modern descendants of these people often live in poverty, their cultures marginalized, their traditions diluted. Yet, within their songs, rituals, and symbols, the pulse of Tartaria still beats. In cities across Russia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and beyond, there remain forgotten monuments with inscriptions no one can read. Star forts turned into military bases. Abandoned observatories that once scanned the heavens for something more than stars. There are churches with no religious origin, halls with perfect acoustics but no known use, and vast underground chambers whose purposes remain officially unknown. Each of these could be a chapter in the Book of Tartaria, if only we still had the language to read it. Yet, as interest in Tartaria grows, so too does the resistance. Mainstream historians dismiss the idea as pseudoscience, conspiracy theory, or internet folklore, and perhaps that's to be expected. No institution wants to admit it may have spent generations perpetuating a leer at best, a half-truth. But the refusal to investigate, to even entertain the questions, speaks volumes. True science welcomes doubt. True history embraces anomalies. The very fact that Tartaria is so aggressively dismissed makes it more worthy of attention. Because deep down many of us feel it, the nagging sense that something about the world is off, that the ruins don't match the timeline, that the technologies came too fast, that the story we're told is missing something vital. Tartaria fills that gap not with certainty, but with possibility, a possible past that reawakens our imagination and our sense of wonder. To truly grasp Tartaria, we must understand that its disappearance was not an event, but a process. It didn't vanish in a single moment, but was peeled away, layer by layer, like an old painting covered in successive coats of new color. And now, as cracks begin to form in that surface, what lies beneath is being revealed not just through buildings and maps, but through a quiet awakening of memory. Not just intellectual memory, but something deeper, almost ancestral, a resonance, a knowing, without knowing how we know. This is perhaps the most difficult part for some to accept, that we might carry inside us some trace of this lost world, that our fascination with domes, spires, sacred geometry, and natural resonance is not random but inherited. When people stand beneath an old cathedral dome and feel a strange vibration, when they trace their fingers along ancient stonework and feel a pull they can't explain, when they hear a certain tone and feel something open within them, perhaps they are remembering something they were never taught. Many believe that Tartaria had a different understanding of consciousness, that its buildings were designed not just for utility, but for emotional and energetic harmony, that music, light, and sacred architecture were all interconnected. This wasn't spiritualism in the modern sense, it was science, a science of the unseen, one that understood that thought, emotion, and intention could shape physical reality, that healing could occur through frequency, that knowledge could be transmitted not just through books, but through space itself. Ancient cultures around the world echo these same ideas. The Vedic texts of India speak of vibrational creation. The Aboriginal Dreamtime speaks of songlines that shape the land. The Egyptian priests tuned their temples to the stars. The Mayans built pyramids that whispered secrets into the wind. Could it be that all these cultures were fragments of a greater whole, a shattered mirror of a once unified civilization? Could Tartaria have been the thread that once connected them? If so, then its erasure becomes even more significant. Because in forgetting Tartaria, we didn't just forget buildings or inventions, we forgot a way of being, a way of listening, a way of living in alignment with the planet and each other. And now, as we face mounting crises of energy, health, and meaning, perhaps the memory of Tartaria returns not as a curiosity, but as a necessity. There are places today that seem to pulse with this forgotten energy. Sacred springs, old cities built upon invisible grids, forgotten observatories and bell towers that still hum faintly when the wind moves just right. There are people who feel drawn to these places, as if guided by something beyond intellect. And there are builders, artists, musicians, and seekers who, without ever hearing the word Tartaria, find themselves recreating its essence, designing buildings with organic forms, using frequencies in healing, searching for harmony in a world of noise. This is the quiet rebirth of Tartaria, not as an empire or a government, but as a memory, as an idea, as a seed in the collective mind of humanity, beginning to sprout once more. And perhaps that is the one thing those who erased Tartaria could never fully destroy: the resonance, the hidden pattern, the sacred geometry that lives not just in stone, but in us. As we continue to peel back the veils obscuring Tartaria, it becomes impossible to ignore the global consistency of its architectural echoes. This isn't just about style or aesthetic, it's about function. The shapes, the proportions, the placement of structures, each detail seems to have been guided by a higher logic, something beyond mere design. In a world driven by efficiency and utility, the elegance and precision of these ancient buildings feel strangely out of place. And yet they are everywhere, in plain sight, in our oldest cities, standing like sentinels of a forgotten language. That language appears to be one of form, resonance, and alignment. Many Tartarian-style buildings are aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and cardinal directions. Others resonate with acoustic perfection. Even more intriguing, many were built on what are now recognized as ley lines, those invisible energetic currents said to flow across the earth. Ancient cultures from Stonehenge to Machu Picchu to Angkor Wat seem to understand these lines intuitively. Tartaria, it seems, did too. Their buildings weren't just beautiful. They were instruments, tuned to the earth, designed to harmonize the human body and mind with the natural world. This raises the question, what kind of worldview builds this way? Clearly, not one focused on conquest or profit. A civilization that designs with harmony and resonance in mind must view itself as a part of nature, not above it. This worldview is so foreign to our modern paradigm that it's difficult even to imagine. We live in a time of rectangles and right angles, of fluorescent lights and concrete walls. In contrast, Tartarian architecture breathes. It curves, spirals, ascends. It reflects the cosmos. It seems built not just to house people, but to inspire them. Another peculiar detail is how many of these grand structures are now repurposed, their original function long forgotten. Ornate buildings that once served unknown roles are now post offices, train stations, courthouses, or even storage facilities. Their interiors often stripped of original detail, their exteriors blackened by soot, buried by pavement, crowded by modern additions. They're treated like background, scenery, practical, old, maybe even haunted, but their form persists. A persistent whisper in the stone. And if we ask why they remain, perhaps it's because they were too strong, too perfect to fully erase. Demolition costs money. Repurposing is easier. Over time, the original purpose is simply forgotten. People walk through them daily, unaware that they are passing through remnants of a world that once thrived on completely different principles. A world that may have understood something we've only just begun to rediscover, that spaces affect consciousness, that form shapes feeling, that silence has structure. In many of these buildings, visitors report a certain feeling, an odd calmness, a shift in perception, a sense of being held by something greater. Is it simply nostalgia for the past? Or is there something encoded in the geometry itself, some secret language of space that still speaks, even when unrecognized? The idea is not as outlandish as it seems. Modern research into sound, light, and frequency shows that the environment directly affects brain waves, heart rate, and emotional state. What if Tartaria knew this? Not as theory, but as a foundation for living? Even the materials used in construction tell a story. Red bricks, often containing iron and magnetic elements, domes sheathed in copper, a powerful conductor. Stone quarried with resonant properties. These choices weren't arbitrary. They point toward a civilization that built with intention, every arch, column, and window placed with purpose. And while we can only guess what some of those purposes were, the consistency is too great to be accidental. So we begin to see Tartaria not just as a lost empire, but as a living system, a network of cities, buildings, and technologies designed to support human potential, not merely to house people, but to uplift them. A civilization built not on extraction, but on expression. And perhaps that's the real revolution. Not that they had free energy or flying machines, but that they believed human beings were worth building for, that our surroundings should elevate us, not diminish us. This idea that architecture could be medicine, that cities could heal, remains as radical now as it likely was then. But maybe it's time to stop seeing it as radical and start seeing it as necessary. As we deepen our understanding of what Tartaria might have been, we begin to notice not only the buildings and technologies that remain, but also the clues hidden within art, maps, and even mythology. The echoes of this lost civilization seem to ripple through every aspect of culture like faint fingerprints left on the mirror of time. Whether intentional or not, fragments of Tartarian knowledge have survived, scattered across different cultures, waiting to be remembered. One place where these echoes are particularly strong is in the symbolic language of flags, coats of arms, and royal insignias. The double-headed eagle, for example, appears across a wide range of cultures, from the Russian Empire to the Holy Roman Empire to ancient Sumer. Traditionally interpreted as a symbol of dual authority, church and state, east and wested may also represent something deeper, a unified vision of power and balance. Some Tartarian researchers believe this symbol was once the emblem of a worldwide civilization, later co-opted by successor states, attempting to claim its legacy. The same could be said of certain myths and legends. Stories of flying cities, floating palaces, towers that reached the sky. Tales once dismissed as fantasy may now be reinterpreted as memories. Dim recollections pass through oral tradition. Many indigenous tribes speak of a time when the sky was different, when people lived in harmony with the earth, when structures resonated with the sun and moon. Could these be distorted memories of Tartaria? Could the myths of giants and sky gods refer to the advanced builders and engineers of a forgotten golden age. Then there are the maps, perhaps the most blatant yet overlooked pieces of evidence. Early cartography, particularly from the 15th to 18th centuries, contains details that defy modern explanation. Whole continents, islands, and regions appear, only to vanish in later editions. Antarctica is shown ice-free. Rivers flow where deserts now stand. And Tartaria itself, sprawling and unmistakably labeled, dominates maps published across Europe, not as a curiosity, but as a geopolitical reality. When asked about it, mainstream historians often wave it off as a placeholder, a name given to unknown lands. But how can an unknown land be drawn in such detail? With cities, rivers, borders, and tribes all clearly marked? It's not just one map, it's dozens, and the consistency between them suggests that Tartaria was not a fantasy, but a known entity gradually erased through successive edits. A quiet deletion, done with cartographic precision. Even the calendars hold secrets. Some Tartarian theorists point to odd discrepancies in historical dating systems, the 13-month lunar calendars, the missing years, the sudden jumps in chronology. Could it be that time itself was altered during one of the so-called resets? That years were added or removed to confuse or compress the timeline? It sounds extreme, until you realize that most of us don't question where our modern dating system came from. We simply accept it. But what if history wasn't just rewritten? What if it was retimed? There's also the compelling idea that Tartaria may have had a different understanding of space and time altogether, that their technology wasn't just physical, but temporal. Certain buildings and artifacts give the impression of being out of place, not just geographically, but chronologically, as if they were brought from another time, another frequency. Could it be that Tartarian knowledge included an understanding of time as a fluid, navigable element, something that could be tuned, like a radio? This would explain the feeling many people describe when encountering these structures, the eerie sense that they are standing outside of time, that the building is somehow watching them, holding a frequency from a forgotten age, that in its stone and symmetry, there lingers a kind of temporal echo, a reminder of what once was, and maybe still is. In this light, Tartaria is not just a civilization we lost. It is a mirror we buried, a reflection of our own highest potential, covered in dust, but not broken, waiting to be seen again. As the image of Tartaria continues to form piece by piece, symbol by symbol, it becomes more than just the story of a lost civilization. It becomes a meditation on what it means to remember, because the further we look into the past, the more it begins to look like a mirror, not just reflecting what was, but what still could be. Tartaria, in this sense, is not merely about architecture, energy, or geopolitics. It is about consciousness. The consciousness of a people, of a planet, and perhaps even of time itself. It's in this deeper layer that the idea of a global reset begins to take root, not just as a catastrophe or engineered event, but as a shift in frequency. Something changed. Something subtle yet enormous. A veil was drawn. A signal was lost. The cities remained. The towers still stood. The bricks did not crumble. And yet something had gone quiet. The world, once filled with resonance and harmony, fell into a kind of sleep. The lights were still on, but the music had stopped. Many Tartaria researchers believe this was not just a material collapse, but a fall in human perception, a loss of attunement, that the energy systems once in place, those that use the air, water, sound, and vibration, relied not only on technology but on human consciousness itself. When that consciousness dimmed, so too did the systems. They became inert. The towers no longer hummed. The domes no longer glowed. The knowledge was not just buried, it was made inaccessible by our own forgetting. This is perhaps why so much of Tartarian architecture feels simultaneously familiar and alien. Familiar because it speaks to something ancient inside us. Alien because we no longer understand how to use it. We see the form, but not the function. We admire the facade, but miss the frequency. These buildings were not just shelters, they were instruments. And we, having lost the manual, now wander through them unaware that they were once alive in ways we can hardly imagine. That loss wasn't accidental. If Tartaria did in fact function through decentralized energy and shared harmony, it would have posed a direct threat to the emerging industrial world. A world built on consumption, separation, and profit. In such a paradigm, a technology that requires no wires, no fuels, no patents, is not only useless, it is dangerous. So the old world had to be covered, rewritten, the structures repurposed, the systems dismantled, the frequencies jammed. And what replaced it? Factories, offices, grid cities, standardized measurements, uniform architecture. Instead of domes, we were given boxes. Instead of spires, smokestacks. Instead of resonance, noise. The transformation was total, but it was not without resistance. All over the world, in folklore and mysticism, in secret societies and quiet traditions, the memory of another way has survived. The stories of ancient knowledge, of sound-based healing, of harmonious design, and of star-connected cities, they never disappeared. They were only suppressed. Today, we stand on a threshold. The digital age has ironically begun to open the doors that were once locked. With access to archives, satellite imagery, and forgotten texts, people are beginning to see the patterns, the buried cities, the identical layouts, the sudden appearance of technologies, the unexplainable structures, and more importantly, they're beginning to feel something. A pull, a vibration, a quiet knowing that somewhere, deep down, we've seen this all before. What if remembering Tartaria is not about going backward, but forward? What if it's the next step in a return to coherence? Not to recreate the past exactly, but to reawaken the principles that guided it, harmony with the earth, architecture that speaks, energy that flows, community that resonates. This isn't nostalgia's evolution, a spiral that brings us back to the beginning, but at a higher octave. In that light, Tartaria is not a mystery to be solved, but a song to be remembered, a frequency we must tune into again. When one begins to view Tartaria as a frequency rather than a place, it changes everything. It shifts the question from where was Tartaria to what state of being did Tartaria represent. This reframing makes sense of the scattered clues, the architectural resonance, the missing history, and the recurring symbols. Tartaria, then, is not simply a civilization we lost, it is a vibration we forgot how to access. And slowly, very slowly, humanity is learning to tune back in. The process of tuning is not easy. Our modern world is a sea of interference electromagnetic fields, synthetic materials, chaotic noise, and artificial rhythms. Most cities are built not for resonance but for density. The materials used absorb energy rather than conduct it. The grid systems disrupt natural flow. And the rhythms of modern life pull us away from any true alignment with Earth's cycles. Against this backdrop, remembering Tartaria becomes an act of quiet rebellion. And yet, the memory persists. Children draw domes and towers without knowing why. Artists are drawn to sacred geometry without being taught. Musicians speak of frequencies that heal. Architects begin to design circular forms, open-air structures, buildings that breathe. Healers speak of water with memory. Farmers speak of soil with song. These are not accidents. They are signs. Signs that the resonance of Tartaria was never fully lost, it only went underground. It is no coincidence that many ancient buildings associated with Tartaria were partially buried, as if the earth itself cradled them, protecting them until we were ready to understand again. Mud flood theory, in this sense, becomes more than a geological mystery. It becomes a metaphor, a cover, a veil, something that hid the truth not to erase it, but to preserve it. And now, as we dig literally and figuratively, we begin to uncover both ruins and remembrance. Photographs from the 1800s show buildings half buried, windows underground, doorways leading to soil. Official history tells us these were design flaws, changes in street levels, accidents of urban development. But the consistency is too great, the anomalies too widespread. These were not mistakes. They were leftovers, traces of a reset, of a world covered over not just with earth, but with a new narrative, a narrative designed not to inform, but to forget. And yet, not all was forgotten. The maps still exist, the journals, the blueprints, the cities, the names. Tartaria lives on in countless forms, encoded into our language, our legends, and our longing. We see it in the symmetry of ancient forts. We hear it in the chime of cathedral bells. We feel it in the strange silence that fills a vast stone hall. These are the echoes, the scattered fragments of something immense and alive. It's tempting to try to categorize Tartariado, define it in historical terms, to place it on a timeline, to pin it down like any other civilization. But that may be exactly the wrong approach. Tartaria defies the linear. It resists confinement. Like sound, like light, it expands, it flows, it adapts. It is not an artifact, it is a field. And just like a field of energy, it is always present, even if we are not always aware of it. The truth is, we don't need to rebuild Tartaria. We need to remember what it stood for. We need to remember how to feel a space, how to listen to silence, how to see with more than eyes. We need to recognize that every tower, every dome, every buried staircase is not just a relic but an invitation to align, to attune, to awaken. And as more of us accept that invitation, the frequency strengthens, the hum returns, And what was once buried begins to rise again, not as ruins, but as a way of life. As the lens through which we view Tartaria continues to widen, so too does the scope of its mystery. No longer confined to forgotten maps or buried foundations, it now seeps into every layer of our constructed world. Tartaria is not just under our feet, it may be embedded in our very worldview. And once we begin to see through its frequency, the surface of modern history begins to fracture. What we were told was progress starts to look like controlled redirection. What we believed to be ruins begin to resemble artifacts of something more sophisticated, more deliberate, and more deeply connected than we've ever imagined. Consider, for a moment, the silence surrounding Tartaria in mainstream academia. Not a footnote, not a controversy, not even a mistake to be corrected. Simply silence. An empire, once spanning half the globe, has been wiped so cleanly from discourse that even its absence seems designed. We are told it never existed, that the maps are outdated, that the names were vague labels, catch-alls for barbarians or nomads. But how do we reconcile that with the precision of those same maps, the uniform architecture, the echoes across cultures that were supposedly isolated from one another? This is not the silence of ignorance. It is the silence of removal, a targeted forgetting, and the sheer effort required to erase something of that scale suggests motive. Tartaria's deletion was not just collateral damage in the passage of time, it was necessary. For someone, for something, perhaps because it stood as a direct contradiction to the systems being constructed in its wake. Those systems centralized government, industrial economies, hierarchical control, cannot coexist with a civilization rooted in autonomy, free energy, and resonance. If Tartaria truly harnessed the vibrational frequencies of the earth, if it built its cities with the intent to harmonize rather than conquer, then it becomes clear why its story had to be overwritten. Not merely for the sake of control, but to prevent the resurgence of an idea that human beings are not separate from the planet, but part of its design, that we are not meant to extract, but to attune. Look at the world that followed Tartaria's disappearance. In a matter of decades, the globe was overtaken by smokestacks, factories, railways, and colonial borders. Cities were redesigned, not for people, but for machines. Streets lost their curves, buildings lost their domes, waterways were paved over. Towers once connected to the sky became symbols of control. The aesthetic of progress changed overnight from organic harmony to rigid grids, and with it, something ancient was broken, not just structurally, but spiritually. And yet, the remnants remain, buried beneath layers of asphalt, hidden behind facades, lurking in libraries under reclassified names. There are records of airships, of healing devices, of buildings powered without wires. There are photographs of massive cities empty of people, of grand architecture predating its supposed builders, of orphans by the thousands with no origin story, and still, the narrative holds firm. Still, the silence remains. But a fracture has opened. In recent years, more and more people have started asking the right questions. Not because they were told to, but because they felt something. A pull, a curiosity, a resonance. This is the true legacy of Tartaria. Not the structures themselves, but the stirring within those who begin to see. That strange sense, so hard to articulate, that there is something just beneath the surface of everything we've ever been taught. A sense that the world is older than it appears, that the ruins are not ruins, that the past is not past. In this way, Tartaria is awakening not as a place on a map, but as a code inside us, a kind of memory that doesn't belong to the mind, but to the soul. To see Tartaria as a Kodea pattern of forgotten frequencies, to realize that its influence never truly ended. It only changed form. What if Tartaria was never meant to survive as a political entity, a nation with armies and borders, but rather as an echo embedded into architecture, myth, memory, and matter? What if its collapse was not the end of a civilization, but the beginning of a test, to see if we could remember, not with textbooks or timelines, but with the deeper parts of ourselves? This idea begins to make sense when we observe the scattered yet persistent motifs of Tartaria. The sacred domes, the star-shaped fortresses, the spires reaching skyward. The geometric perfection of cities designed in concentric rings. These designs are not random. They are not aesthetic choices of disconnected builders across distant lands. They are signatures, signposts, clues that point back to a unified knowledge system, one that spoke through form, vibration, and proportion. And then there are the maps, those quiet witnesses to the old world. Each one, especially those from before the 1800s, tells a different story than the one we're taught. They show lands that don't exist anymore, cities no one talks about, names no one remembers. They mark entire empires with confidence. Then, without warning, those same names vanish in later editions. Tartaria, once sprawling across Eurasia, is suddenly gone, and no one seems to know why. Even more curious is how many of those maps align with ancient ley lines, Earth's energetic pathways, known to indigenous cultures for millennia. If Tartaria understood this grid and built in harmony with it, then perhaps its disappearance had more to do with severing humanity from that grid than anything else. Maybe the point wasn't just to erase a civilization, but to break the connection between people and planet, to block the current, to disrupt the signal. If Tartarian cities were tuned to these energy flows, then burying them literally and symbolically would dampen that resonance, covering domes with tar, demolishing towers, replacing star forts with office blocks, tearing up ancient roads to pour asphalt, and, most importantly, changing the narrative, making sure that those who inherited the structures had no idea what they were, that the code remained unreadable. But now, slowly, the code is being deciphered. Artists, architects, healers, explorers, and seekers of all kinds are tuning in. Some by studying old blueprints and photographs, others by walking the streets of ancient cities and simply feeling. Some can't explain it, but they know. They feel a hum when they enter a certain space. They feel clearer, lighter, or strangely emotional in the presence of certain forms. This is not fantasy. This is the forgotten science of resonance. This is the living memory of Tartaria. And perhaps it was meant to happen this way. Perhaps Tartaria was not meant to last as a structure, but to sleep as a seed, buried, yes, but never dead, encoded into the stones of silent towers, hidden in the geometry of fountains, waiting in the echoes of abandoned halls. And now, as the world begins to question itself more deeply than ever before, those seeds are starting to grow. The question is not whether Tartaria was real. The evidence is everywhere. The question is whether we are ready to hear what it's trying to tell us, whether we can remember how to feel, how to build with intention, how to live in rhythm. Tartaria is not trying to return as it was, but as what it represented. A civilization in tune, a people aligned, a way of being that harmonized matter and spirit. And that memory is still humming in the stone. To grasp the full implications of Tartaria's erasure, one must consider the broader machinery that replaced it. Not just cities and governments, but entire belief systems. The world after Tartaria was not simply a continuation, it was a recalibration of thought, of language, of perception itself. It was as if a veil had been drawn across the human mind, filtering what we could see, what we could feel, and what we were allowed to know. Tartaria wasn't just deleted, it was overwritten. And in its place came something far colder, far more rigid, and far less alive. Consider the education systems that emerged after the great resets and fires of the 19th century. Institutionalized learning, rigid curriculums, memorization without understanding, a sharp turn away from intuitive knowledge, oral history, and experiential learning. Children no longer learn from their elders or the land. They learn from state-sanctioned books. Books that contained a streamlined version of history, trimmed of contradictions, edited for clarity, scrubbed clean of anomalies. Tartaria, with all its ambiguity and resonance, had no place in this new framework. This shift didn't happen by accident. It was systematic. Libraries burned, archives rewritten, and generations raised without ever being given the language to even ask the right questions. When you remove a word, you remove the ability to think about the concept it represents. By erasing Tartaria, the controllers weren't just removing a chapter, they were erasing the very idea that something like it could have ever existed. And yet, some of it escaped, not through textbooks, but through symbols, through architecture, through intuition. In the designs of old buildings that still stand, their forgotten functions echo faintly. In the folk stories and lullabies passed down in rural villages. In the sacred chants of indigenous peoples. In strange dreams and déjà vu that defy logic. Tartaria lives on in the cracks between what we were taught and what we feel to be true. The notion of resonance continues to surface, particularly in the idea that sound, geometry, and intention were once fused into a singular form of expression. Buildings weren't just structures, they were instruments. Frequencies, when played or sung within certain domes or chambers, would create harmonics that aligned with human biology. Sound baths, healing bells, tuning forks. These are not New Age inventions. They may be remnants, poorly understood tools from a civilization that knew how to heal with vibration. One can imagine Tartarian cities not just as places of residence, but as orchestrated environments, entire landscapes arranged like symphonies, streets aligned with the stars, towers that collected atmospheric energy, fountains not merely decorative, but tuned to cleanse both water and spirit, every aspect of life considered, designed, intentional. And when we compare that vision to our present, something inside us stirs. We walk down narrow concrete corridors, Listen to the drone of fluorescent lights. Breathe air filtered through machines, surrounded by angles and edges and flat-screen distractions. The contrast is jarring. It's no wonder so many people feel lost, disoriented, sick. The resonance is gone. The frequencies are out of tune. But perhaps not forever. Perhaps the first step to real healing is to remember that it wasn't always like this. That cities can be sacred. That light can carry meaning. That sound can transform. That energy can be drawn from the air shared freely, used for harmony not profit. These aren't fantasies. They are echoes, glimpses of a forgotten truth. Tartaria challenges us to imagine what else might be possible, not as utopia, but as memory, not as myth, but as blueprint. And once that idea is planted in the mind, it cannot be undone. It grows. It questions. It resonates. If Tartaria was erased to make room for something else, then what exactly took its place? The answer is as subtle as it is massive. What replaced Tartaria was a world built on disconnection. Disconnection from the land. Disconnection from the sky. Disconnection from each other. And ultimately, from ourselves. The new world order that emerged wasn't just geopolitical, was psychological. It altered our sense of time, our place in the cosmos, and our understanding of what it means to be human. Before the reset, time was circular. Seasons flowed, marked by the stars. People rose with the sun, slept with the moon, measured life in rhythms. After the reset, time became mechanical, divided into hours, minutes, seconds, enforced by bells, whistles, and ticking clocks. Time became a system of control. And with it came calendars filled with wars, rulers, industrial triumphs, but stripped of mystery, stripped of the deep, resonant knowing that we once belonged to something far greater. This artificial timeline left no room for Tartaria. Its silence is conspicuous. Where are its inventors, philosophers, poets? Where are its creation myths, its epics, its ruins with plaques? Other ancient civilizations have left their mark. Egypt, Greece, Rome, the Maya. Tartaria, by contrast, feels like a whisper buried under concrete. And yet the clues suggest it was larger, more advanced, and more unified than any of them. Could it be that it simply did not conform to the narrative of progress our world was built upon? For in Tartaria's world, energy was not mined, it was gathered. Water was not contaminated, it was sung to. Buildings were not lit by wires but by resonance. Children were not processed, they were nurtured. People did not live in competition, they lived in harmony. To acknowledge this is to acknowledge that the modern world, for all its marvels, is profoundly out of tune. And perhaps that is why Tartaria had to go, not because it failed, but because it succeeded in a way that could not be allowed to continue. And so, it was folded into myth. Its maps were redrawn, its symbols repurposed, its people rebranded, its memory suppressed, until only ruins remained. And even those were buried, repurposed, or misunderstood. Star forts became military relics. Resonance chambers became churches. Towers of energy became clock towers or steeples. The deeper meanings were lost hidden in plain sight. Yet something within us remembers, not with words, but with sensation. A feeling when standing before an old perfect arch. a strange emotion in a sunbeam through stained glass, a stirring in the bones when walking a spiral path or touching carved stone. These are not coincidences. They are keys, triggers, reminders. And now, people across the world are beginning to follow those feelings, not toward dogma or doctrine, but toward something far more ancient, a rediscovery of sacred geometry, a fascination with cymatics and sound healing, a hunger for truth in maps, buildings, and forgotten books, a quest not just for knowledge, but for resonance. Tartaria's return is not about reclaiming land or power. It is about restoring a lost relationship with energy, with space, with each other. It is a shift back into alignment. One building, one song, one remembered frequency at a time. Because the truth is, Tartaria never left. It's been waiting. In the stone, in the silence, in us. The story of Tartaria is not just found in ruins or relics. It's found in the subtle dissonance that so many feel but cannot name, a kind of collective homesickness for a place we've never seen, a sense that something is missing, not just in the historical record, but in the very fabric of reality, as if a great silence had settled over the world, and in that silence, something vital was taken from us, something not only external, but internal, a knowing, a connection, a resonance. One of the most fascinating and often overlooked elements tied to Tartaria is the concept of inherited memory, not genetic memory in the traditional sense, but something more subtle. Ancestral echoes pass through dream, intuition, and emotion. Many people describe inexplicable feelings of familiarity when visiting certain cities, walking through ancient buildings, or gazing at the curved lines of forgotten architecture. These responses are not intellectual, they're visceral, a quiet sense of déjà vu, as though their soul had been there before. Science is beginning to explore this idea through the lens of epigenetics and collective consciousness. Memories, emotions, even traumas can pass down through generations encoded not just in DNA, but in the subtle energetic fields around us. If so, then perhaps Tartaria lives on not in documents or monuments alone, but in us, in how we feel drawn to the old ways, in how we seek harmony, even when surrounded by dissonance, in how some part of us still remembers how to live in tune. The deeper one explores Tartaria, the clearer it becomes that its disappearance was not solely about the physical destruction of buildings or records. It was about the disruption of resonance. It was about creating a world in which such a civilization would seem impossible. A world where everything was compartmentalized, categorized, and explained away. Where mystery was mocked and intuition dismissed. The energy lines were buried, the old towers dismantled, the domes silenced, and we were told that this was progress. But true progress does not come from forgetting. It comes from integration, from remembering what we were, understanding what we are, and envisioning what we could be again. Tartaria offers a model not just of structures, but of values, not just of inventions, but of intentions. Imagine a world where energy is shared freely, where architecture uplifts the human spirit, where cities are aligned with celestial rhythms, where water flows with purity and purpose, where knowledge is sacred and silence is respected. That may sound like fantasy, but fragments of that world still surround us. In certain monasteries, ancient bells ring at specific frequencies known to calm the nervous system. In forgotten villages, healing chants echo in caves built into the earth's resonance points. In remote areas of Asia and Eastern Europe, elders still speak of the old cities, places of light and learning, now covered in soil or hidden beneath modern construction. The stories persist. They slip through the cracks in the official narrative like wildflowers pushing through concrete, and in them, the name Tartaria still lingers, sometimes spoken, sometimes implied, always just out of reach. But perhaps that's the way memory works. It doesn't shout, it waits. It waits for the quiet moments, those rare pauses when the noise of modern life subsides and we finally hear the hum, the low, steady vibration of something ancient, something whole. Tartaria is not trying to convince us with facts or timelines. It is inviting us to feel, to slow down, to listen. Because if we do, if we truly allow ourselves to feel what has been forgotten, we might find that we were never as disconnected as we thought. We might find that the threads were always there, just buried, like the windows beneath the street, like the stars behind the smog, like the self beneath the story. There's a peculiar beauty in the way Tartaria returns, not as a revelation imposed from without, but as a recognition arising from within. It is not a discovery that comes from digging alone, but from attunement, from walking the old roads with new eyes, from looking at stone not as dead material, but as memory made solid. In a world so saturated with noise and urgency, the story of Tartaria offers something different, something slower, deeper, something that resonates long after the last word is spoken. Let us return again to the architecture, because it is through the buildings that Tartaria most visibly speaks. Their size alone confounds explanation. Structures claim to have been built by small frontier towns with limited manpower, yet featuring stone columns 6 stories tall, domes wider than cathedrals, and facades etched with precision that would challenge even today's machinery. These are not coincidences. They are signatures of another paradigm, one where construction was guided by principles we have long forgotten. The repetition of forms across continents is especially telling. The same motifs: arched windows, onion domes, star fortresses, intricately tiled floors appear in places that had no contact with one another, if we believe the official timelines. How does one explain this unity of design? Cultural diffusion? Colonial influence? These answers ring hollow when faced with such synchronicity. It's more plausible, more honest to consider that these were not separate cultures borrowing from one another, but scattered expressions of a single, unified knowledge system that once spanned the earth. That system likely didn't just concern physical construction. It included energy, how it flows, how it heals, how it sustains life. Many Tartarian researchers believe that water, specifically, was central to their technology, not just for drinking or transport, but as a conductor of frequency. Many of the remaining buildings feature elaborate waterworks, fountains, pools, channels that don't align with modern plumbing logic. What if these were more than decorative? What if they were components in an energetic grid, harmonizing the frequencies of entire cities? Sound, too, played a key role. Large halls with perfect acoustics, pipes and chambers embedded into walls, and towers that may have served as resonance amplifiers. All of it points to an understanding of sonic energy as a tool for healing and balance. In this model, sound wasn't just entertainment, it was medicine. It shaped matter, cleared fields, and aligned human emotion. The cathedral wasn't a place for sermons, it was a frequency chamber. The bell tower wasn't for telling time, it was for tuning the city. Of course, to fully embrace this view requires a shift in perception. It means letting go of the belief that we are the peak of human advancement. It means accepting that the past may hold technologies and ways of being that surpass our own. That is a difficult truth for modernity to swallow. So much of our identity is tied to the notion of upward progress. But what if the arc of history is not a straight line, but a wave, rising and falling, forgetting and remembering, dissonance and resonance? In that context, Tartaria is not an outlier. It is part of a cycle, a high point, a moment when humanity was in tune. And now, perhaps, we are rising again. Not to copy what was, but to rediscover what was known. To look at the domes, the towers, the buried floor sand, feel the invitation beneath them. Not just to remember, but to resonate once more. If Tartaria truly was a civilization built on resonance, then it stands in direct contrast to the modern world, a quiet mirror, reflecting everything we've lost and everything we could regain. And as more people begin to feel this contrast, not through lectures or books, but through inner knowing, a subtle awakening begins. A shift in how we see the world. We stop asking, was Tartaria real? And begin to ask, what part of me already remembers? Because the truth is, Tartaria speaks in a language beyond facts. It speaks through intuition, through frequency, through form. It speaks through the stillness of domed ceilings, the flow of spiral staircases, the echo in ancient halls. It speaks in cities that feel older than their history, and in buildings whose purpose feels deeper than their current use. It speaks in maps that don't make sense until you see them as memory, not territory. One of the most profound realizations is that Tartaria might not have ended in a single catastrophe, but through 1,000 small manipulations. The removal of symbols, the renaming of landmarks, the repurposing of structures, the rewriting of textbooks, a soft erasure spread out over generations so that even the descendants forgot. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because the world around them had been rewired. Their calendars were changed, their stars realigned, their clocks reset. There are buildings today that appear to predate the cities they stand in. Foundations that seem too massive for the culture credited with building them. Entire levels buried below modern street level, sometimes revealed by accident during renovation or excavation. Doors that lead to earth. Windows that look into stone. Why? Why do these anomalies exist in so many cities around the world? Is it truly just subsidence? Or is it sediment from a flood? A mud flood, as the theory goes, a global event, whether natural or engineered, that buried an entire civilization beneath feet of earth. And not just physical earth, but cultural earth, semantic sediment, layers of language and meaning piled atop truths that now sound like myths. Star forts are called military defenses. Cathedrals are churches. Obelisks are monuments. But what if they weren't originally any of those things? What if their true purpose has been hidden behind new names? What if these were energy nodes, harmonic chambers, vibrational beacons? And what if we no longer have the means or the permission to interpret them correctly? Even the way we define civilization has changed. Today, we measure progress in GDP, skyscraper height, data speed. But what if Tartaria measured it in harmony, in alignment with the Earth's frequencies, in collective well-being, in the subtle art of tuning spaces to uplift the soul? What if their technology wasn't about dominance, but coherence? Not about bending nature, but resonating with it? In this light, the disappearance of Tartaria becomes more than historicality, becomes metaphysical, a falling out of tune, a planetary disharmony, a forgetting not just of names and dates, but of purpose, of why we build, of how we live, of what we're meant to feel when we walk into a space, and it greets us like a song. And yet, some part of us still remembers. That's why this story draws people in not with proof, but with pull. A magnetic sense that beneath all the layers, something essential remains. Waiting, not to be reconstructed, but to be recognized. As we look deeper into the bones of our cities, the evidence of a world before ours grows harder to dismiss. The buildings themselves tell the story not just through their grandeur, but through their forgotten symmetry. You can feel it when you stand before them. The scale, the proportions, the materials, they speak a language that modern architecture has long since abandoned. A language that doesn't speak in blueprints and budgets, but in vibration, sacred ratios, and connection to the land. It's not just that the buildings are old, it's that they feel older than they're allowed to be. A city like St. Petersburg, for example, was supposedly founded in the early 1700s. And yet, it was almost immediately filled with monumental structures, cathedrals, museums, palaces that would take decades or centuries to complete with the tools of the time. And similar patterns are found in other founded cities. Chicago, Melbourne, San Francisco, where immense stone and brick buildings appear fully formed, then either buried by mysterious floods or consumed by suspicious fires. Were these cities truly built in a few years by settlers with limited tools? Or were they rediscovered, dug out, rebranded, claimed? Could they be the surface fragments of something far older? A global network of cities, once interconnected, now severed and renamed? The theory of Tartaria suggests just that what we call colonization may have been, in part, reoccupation. That beneath the stories of pioneers and industrialists lie older, stranger truths. Even the supposed ruins of ancient empires, Mayan, Khmer, Babylonian, begin to resemble Tartarian outposts. Their geometric alignments, their energetic placement, their silent grandeur, all echo the same intention: to harmonize, to uplift, to resonate. And the more one studies them, the harder it becomes to draw a clean line between myth and memory. It's as if humanity has been rebooted multiple times, and in each version, pieces of the old code survive. Tartaria might be the most recent of these echoes, not lost in the distant mists of antiquity, but just behind the curtain of industrial history, just beneath the foundation of our oldest cities, just outside the reach of official timelines. And perhaps That's why it still resonates so deeply, because it's not ancient in the way we think of ancient. It's recent enough to be visible, yet just distant enough to be mysterious. It's a ghost city we've built our modern world on top of, without ever realizing it. This realization opens the door to a deeper truth, that we are not separate from Tartaria, that we are its living descendants, not through bloodlines or ancestry alone, but through memory, through feeling, through the subtle, unshakable sense that there was once a better way to live and that it's still within reach. We see it in the natural pull toward domes and arches, in the revival of sacred geometry in art and design, in the growing interest in sound healing, permaculture, and decentralized energy. These are not new ideas. They are reawakenings, reemergences, signals returning to a population ready to hear them again. And perhaps that is Tartaria's final lesson, that no matter how thoroughly a civilization is buried by time, by flood, by manipulation, it can still rise again. Not through conquest, not through empire, but through remembrance, through resonance, through rebuilding our lives not just with tools, but with intention. Tartaria does not need to be rebuilt in stone. It needs to be rebuilt in us. By this point, Tartaria no longer feels like a distant, speculative idea. It feels like a presence, a hidden layer woven through the reality we walk through every day. In the bricks beneath our feet, in the towers rising above our heads, in the questions we weren't taught to ask. It is both nowhere and everywhere. Not in a single nation or document, but in the silence between history's lines. And it waits, not for proof, but for attention. Perhaps one of the clearest ways Tartaria reveals itself is in the things that don't quite fit the architectural anomalies scattered across continents. Enormous stone arches standing in otherwise modest towns. Vast civic buildings towering above small city populations. Train stations fit for millions, operating in cities that never had that many passengers. Water towers more elaborate than necessary. World's fairest structures, built impossibly fast, only to be destroyed. Time and again, we see signs of a forgotten magnitude, a scale of thinking and building, far beyond what was practical for the time. These structures seem to have been inherited, not created. Look closely at many of them, and you'll find mismatched bricks, sealed lower floors, doorways submerged below ground level. Some have stairs leading to windows instead of entrances. Others have no foundations at all, as if they were uncovered rather than erected. In city after city, layer after layer, we find clues that hint at a previous civilization, one whose presence was not erased by time, but by deliberate reclassification. And what about the people? If Tartaria existed, and if it was indeed a global network of resonant architecture, free energy, and human harmony, then where did its citizens go? Were they displaced? Assimilated? Eliminated? Some theories speak of resets not just technological, but demographic. The orphan trains of the 19th century come to mind. Tens of thousands of children moved across countries, resettled with no records of their true origin. Were they orphans in the traditional sense, or survivors of a world swept away? This leads us into uncomfortable territory, because if Tartaria ended through a reset, that means someone or something wanted it to end. Not simply a shift in civilization, but a wiping of the slate. A re-templating of Earth. In such a scenario, Tartaria becomes a memory not only hidden but forbidden, a model of a world that was too whole, too harmonious, to be allowed to continue. And yet, like a suppressed memory in the human mind, it begins to surface anyway, quietly, steadily, undeniably. The resurgence of interest in sound healing, water structuring, sacred geometry, electromagnetic medicine, these are not trends. They are recollections, fragments of a science that once was common sense, a knowing that once needed no proof, because it was felt, lived, shared. Tartaria is returning not through textbooks or academia, but through dreams, intuitions, and the spaces in which people gather to remember together. Even art begins to shift. Music changes. Buildings begin to round again. Communities form not around commerce, but coherence. Gardens return to cities. People walk barefoot, listen to birdsong. Sketch spirals. These are small acts, but each one is a step closer to resonance. Each one is a frequency remembered. Because the truth, if we allow ourselves to feel it, is that Tartaria never truly left. It simply changed forms. It sank beneath our awareness, waiting not to be rebuilt, but to be relived. Now that we've traveled so far into the misted edge of forgotten history, a shift begins to happen in how we perceive Tartaria. No longer just a theory or a mystery, it starts to feel like something more intimate, like a memory surfacing slowly after lifetimes of silence. The deeper we go, the clearer it becomes that Tartaria's story is not one of endings but of echoes. It was never fully erased. It was only suppressed. And now that suppression is fading, one of the most compelling aspects of this awakening lies in the patterns that repeat across cultures. The same shapes, symbols, and systems appear again and again: triangles, spirals, domes, resonant chambers, golden ratios. In Sufi architecture, in Vedic temples, in Moorish mosaics, in Russian cathedrals, in Pueblo kivas, all contain similar vibrational mathematics. If these similarities arose independently, it would be a miracle. But if they stem from a shared origin, unified global understanding of sacred design, then we're no longer speaking of isolated traditions. We're speaking of fragments from the same original song. That song, some say, was based on cymatics, the study of visible sound vibrations. Tartaria may have used cymatic principles not only in music, but in architecture, agriculture, and even healing. Buildings arranged in ways that amplified harmony, fountains tuned to specific frequencies, towers that collected and radiated energy in ways we've forgotten how to measure. The ancients understood that sound was more than entertainment, it was structure. It shaped water, it moved matter, it guided consciousness. And so, we begin to reconsider all those cathedrals, not as religious structures, but as sonic temples, not spaces to worship outside deities, but to harmonize the inner self. These buildings were often constructed without visible blueprints, using materials with piezoelectric properties: stone, quartz, copper. Their domes amplified sound. Their arches guided vibration. Their columns hummed with subtle frequency. This wasn't mysticism. It was science, a science of resonance. This is why the erasure of Tartaria had to be so complete. Not just a rewriting of history, but a distortion of the very tools we use to understand the world. Physics reduced to particles. medicine reduced to chemicals, architecture reduced to function, the soul removed from the equation. In such a paradigm, Tartaria becomes unthinkable. Not because it's implausible, but because it doesn't fit inside the box we've been given. But boxes have seams, and the seams are splitting. You can see it in how people are drawn to the ancient ways, to cities of light, to sound baths and spiral gardens. You can hear it in the growing chorus of those questioning official timelines, feeling the hum in old walls, learning the language of geometry once more, and perhaps most powerfully you can feel it in the silence. The deep, vibrating silence between the old bricks, the unspoken spaces in ancient halls, where no one speaks, but everyone remembers. Tartaria is not coming back as it was. It is coming back through us. Not to dominate, not to explain, but to vibrate again. As we continue to explore the forgotten framework of Tartaria, something profound begins to unfold, not just a lost civilization, but the faint outline of an ancient design, a blueprint that stretches far beyond stone and structure. It is a design of life, of rhythm, of being. Tartaria, if it ever truly existed in the way the traces suggest, was not merely a civilization, it was a tuning fork, a living resonance meant to bring harmony not just to cities, but to the entire planetary field. And perhaps this is why it had to disappear. A system that honored the earth, the stars, the human body and spirit as one, could not survive in a world being reshaped by profit and hierarchy. Tartaria's fall was not the collapse of an empire, it was the silencing of a song, but not completely. That song continues, in echoes, in vibrations, in small places of stillness. In the spaces between, we see these echoes in the overlooked corners of the modern world, in the inexplicably beautiful city layouts of places we're told were hastily built, in the water systems that seem too advanced for their time, in the ornate structures said to be designed by unknown or undocumented hands. And we feel them in ourselves in that sense of disconnect when we step into modern spaces, and in the opposite sensation when we encounter something ancient, something that just feels right. Even now, we can feel when a place is built with love, with intention, with presence. Tartarian structures were not made for efficiency, they were made for experience. Their curves invited movement. Their chambers invited voice. Their towers didn't just rise, they reached. And those who walked among them likely felt something we've lost the words for. A kind of peace, a deep alignment with place. Not just aesthetic pleasure, but vibrational integration. This alignment may have been reinforced by geography. Many Tartarian cities were positioned near the confluences of rivers, under major star paths, or directly on ley lines, the energetic arteries of the earth known to countless indigenous cultures. Some buildings may have even functioned as transformers, gathering, amplifying, and distributing subtle energies through architecture, not in the sense of electricity alone, but of field harmonics, life force, vitality. If this sounds foreign, that's only because our current language does not accommodate such things. We speak of volts, watts, and particles. They may have spoken of tone, form, and field. Theirs was a science of flow, ours a science of force. Their collapse, then, was not just a historical moment, it was a dimensional shift. The loss of a worldview that saw life as symphony, replaced by one that sees it as mechanism. Yet here we are, in the early stages of remembering, architects rediscovering biophilic design, engineers reimagining zero-point energy, musicians exploring healing frequencies, educators abandoning rigid systems for rhythm and story, people leaving cities that suffocate to build places that breathe. This is not a return to the past, it is the past returning through us. Tartaria, in this sense, never died. It was encoded, seeded, stored in the subconscious layers of humanity, waiting for a moment when the signal would be strong enough to be heard again. And now, as the world begins to vibrate with questions no one taught us to ask, the signal grows louder. By now, Tartaria has ceased to be a mere theory or speculation. It has become a lens and instrument through which we view not only the past, but the potential future. As we walk the streets of old cities, step inside ancient halls, or stand before silent stone towers, we are not just observing history, we are encountering a question, one that has never been answered officially, but one that continues to whisper in dreams and quiet moments of awe. Could it be that our ancestors once lived in a world more harmonious than ours? Not primitive, not utopian, but aligned. Could it be that what we call lost knowledge was never truly lost, only locked away, waiting for the right hearts to open it again? One cannot explore the architecture of Tartaria without feeling this question resonate. In cities as distant as Kazan and San Francisco, Istanbul and Vienna, we see patterns that speak the same language. The domes, spires, and arches all tuned, all flowing, all singing the same silent song. They carry a sense of dignity not found in modern design. They were made not just to shelter, but to inspire. And there's something else, something more subtle but no less important. These buildings seem to breathe, not in the biological sense, but in energetic rhythm. Their proportions align with natural harmonics. Their windows follow solar movement. Their interiors are shaped like the body itself, cathedrals mirroring rib cages, towers like spines, rooms like hearts. It is as if the builders were not separate from the structures but extensions of the same whole. This is what Tartaria may have understood, that human life and sacred space are not two things, but one. That architecture is not decoration but medicine. That frequency is not background but foundation. They did not dominate the land, they danced with it. Their cities were not imposed on the earth. They grew from it. And when we consider how far we've come from that understanding, it can be overwhelming. Our cities hum, not with harmony, but with dissonance. We've built towers that block the sky, roads that sever rivers, machines that drown birdsong, and yet through all this noise something deeper endures. Because Tartaria is not a place we need to return to. It is a field we are beginning to re-enter, a realm of intention, of alignment, of resonance. We carry its seeds in our curiosity, in the questions we ask when the official answers fall flat, in the feelings we have when we encounter beauty that makes no sense, in the moments we turn away from screens and noise to listen to the silence beneath. That silence is not empty. It is filled with memory. It is where the song of Tartaria still plays. And every time we recognize that song, in a structure, a sound, or within ourselves, the forgotten begins to return. As the journey nears its final stretch, we begin to realize something strange, perhaps even sacred. The story of Tartaria is no longer a mystery we are trying to solve. It has become a story we are remembering. And that remembrance is not arriving through institutions or discoveries, but through feeling, through resonance, through a quiet pulse that moves beneath the skin of our modern world, unnoticed by most, but undeniable once felt. By now, we've walked through many of the signs-buried cities, impossibly constructed buildings, identical architecture across vast distances, tales of resets, mysterious technologies, and echoes of sacred knowledge. We've seen how cities were not just built but tuned, how structures may have drawn from the sky what we now struggle to produce in labs. We've begun to see how the very shape of civilization was once based on frequency, not on control. And as we revisit those structures, still standing those old libraries, post offices, railway stations, and palaces begin to understand the deeper function they may have once served. They weren't just public buildings, they were instruments. Their materials marble, granite, copper, quartz chosen not for cost but for conductivity. Their doma shaped to catch sound, to create vortices, their pillars designed for symmetry, for anchoring fields. These were not decorations. They were the syntax of an energetic language, one we are only now starting to translate again. We were never taught to see buildings as living beings. We were never shown that a city could be a song. But in Tartaria, it seems that was understood. And perhaps that's why, to this day, we feel something stir in the presence of those places. Something ancient and tender. Something forgotten, but familiar. That subtle emotion isn't nostalgia, it's recognition. A vibration meeting a memory. And then we turn back to the present. We compare what we see now, the concrete, the neon, the noisto, what once was. And it becomes clear that the modern world was not built to uplift us. It was built to extract from us our attention, our energy, our connection. We live in boxes, under flickering lights, away from the stars, with rhythms that don't match the heartbeat of the earth. And yet, despite all this, something inside us still yearns, still searches, still sings. That's the essence of Tartaria. Not a lost city, not a map, not even a timeline, but a vibration so powerful that it endured centuries of suppression and is now re-emerging through you, through me, through all of us, in the way we seek light, water, quiet, in the way we stop to look at a building and feel something we can't explain, in the way we return to nature, not for escape, but for remembrance. Perhaps the truth is this: Tartaria is not returning to us, we are returning to it. The closer we come to the essence of Tartaria, the more its mystery unfolds into something less like a riddle and more like a revelation. The realization that what we seek was never truly lost, only hidden behind layers of misunderstanding, deliberate misdirection, and the slow erosion of collective memory. What we call Tartaria may never be fully defined, and perhaps that is its greatest gift. It resists the mind and speaks instead to the soul. Because what kind of civilization would build in this way? What kind of people would spend time, resources, and knowledge crafting structures that served not only function, but beauty, balance, and spiritual resonance? What kind of world would create public spaces that healed rather than overwhelmed? The answer is simple and yet profound. A world not based on competition, but coherence. A civilization not obsessed with consumption, but with connection. A people who understood that the human being is not a machine, but a frequency. And when you start with that, understanding, everything changes. Medicine changes, education changes, architecture, law, art, food, even time itself, all begin to flow from a deeper alignment. That alignment appears to have once existed, and the remnants point back to a global system of harmony that we only glimpse through fragments now. Star forts that mirror magnetic fields, obelisks that serve as tuning forks, towers built not just to reach the sky, but to gather from it, cities laid out not randomly, but in sacred geometries. Even the most skeptical observer must admit the consistency across continents, cultures, and centuries is too exact to be accidental. And yet, it's not about proving anything anymore. Not really, because as this journey has shown us, the truth of Tartaria is not buried in some hidden archive or locked vaults in our response. It's in the feeling we get when we step into an old building and feel suddenly, inexplicably at peace. It's in the hum of a cathedral dome, in the symmetry of a spiral staircase, in the moment when silence feels louder than sound. Those moments are reminders, clues, invitations to remember that there was a time and could be again when the world was built with the human spirit in mind, not against it, when cities were sanctuaries, when sound was sacred, when water was wisdom, and when life moved in cycles, not schedules. So perhaps we must stop thinking of Tartaria as something that was destroyed, and start thinking of it as something that is waiting to be reawakened, not through monuments or maps, but through intention, through how we build our homes, how we grow our food, how we teach our children, how we speak to one another. The return of Tartaria is not the reappearance of an empire. It is the return of a way of seeing, a way of listening, a way of living. And for those who feel its call, no proof is needed. The resonance is enough. You don't need to believe in Tartaria to recognize its truth. You only need to remember what it feels like to stand in a place and feel whole again. As we draw closer to the end of this long and winding path through the forgotten corridors of Tartaria, something begins to settle, a sense of quiet knowing. The kind of knowing that doesn't need to be argued or defended. The kind of truth that lives not in facts but in frequencies, in feeling, in recognition. We no longer look at Tartaria as a puzzle to be solved, but as a memory to be embraced. One that returns not with drama, but with stillness, like the first light after a long night. If there's one theme that continues to emerge, it's this. Tartaria was not just a placid, was a principle of harmony. A design that understood life not as separate pieces to be controlled, but as one unified field to be tuned. Their cities were instruments, their building songs made solid, their towers antennas not only to the sky, but to the inner world of spirit. And it's that vision of coherence, of connection that the modern world seems to have lost. But even now, under layers of concrete and confusion, the design still pulses. We see it in the geometric patterns carved into cathedral ceilings, in the alignment of old stone streets, in the rhythms of bell towers and fountains. We hear it in the stories of the elders, in the legends of the sky people, in the whispers of dreamtime. Tartaria isn't gone, it's just been quieted, covered over, left dormant like seeds waiting for the spring. And maybe that spring is now. Because all over the world, something is shifting. People are building differently, listening differently, feeling differently. There's a growing intuition that the way forward isn't about Moritz, about remembering, about returning to what we once knew in our bones, that we are not here to conquer nature, but to harmonize with it. That architecture should breathe, that sound can heal, that water carries memory, that light speaks. These ideas are not new, they are ancient. They are Tartarian. And as they return, not as facts, but as frequencies, we begin to feel that maybe the fall of Tartaria wasn't the end of something, but the hiding of something sacred until we were ready again. Maybe the silence was part of the design. Maybe we had to forget in order to truly value what we are now beginning to remember. And now, we find ourselves on the edge of rediscovery, not of empires or monuments, but of meaning. The buildings that remain are not just echoes, they are guides. The old maps are not outdated, they are invitations. The resonance we feel in certain places is not accidental, it is intentional. And the most powerful reminder of all is that this world, this forgotten world, is already inside us. We are not just descendants of Tartaria. We are its continuation. To reach this far into the story of Tartaria is to have walked a long way, not only across time and place, but across the inner terrain of what it means to be human. It's not simply about what we've uncovered, it's about how we've changed in the process. The journey through Tartaria is not merely historical, it is initiatory, a slow shedding of assumptions, a quiet restoration of perception. Because once you see it, truly see it, you can't go back. The city is no longer just streets and buildings. It becomes a living field. Every old structure holds a vibration, every brick a frequency, every curve, every dome, every spire, a story. You walk past a forgotten post office and suddenly realize you're standing inside a former energy temple. You step into a courthouse and feel the harmonics of an ancient resonant chamber, and you begin to wonder, how many places have we mislabeled? How many instruments have we silenced by calling them ruins? The act of renaming was perhaps the most powerful tool in Tartaria's erasure. By changing the labels, the meanings were severed. By shifting function, intention was lost. But form remains. And form remembers. You can bury knowledge under words, but you can't erase vibration. It lingers. In the curves, in the stone, in the air. And the more we learn to feel again, the more we hear what the buildings have been trying to say all along. It's not just the architecture, of course. It's the worldview behind it. A worldview that saw the planet as alive, that saw humans as stewards, not owners. That built not with ego, but with listening, with reverence. It's easy to romanticize such a civilization, but what if it wasn't romantic? What if it was simply balanced? What if it was the natural result of understanding the energetic nature of reality and choosing to live in accordance with it? Imagine cities built according to the pulse of the earth, where water was guided like breath through stone lungs, where bells rang in tune with the stars, where every building played its role in an orchestra of space. This was not idealism, it was science. A kind of science we no longer recognize because we stopped listening. But that doesn't mean it's gone. That doesn't mean it can't return. And perhaps it's already returning. You feel it when someone sings in a cathedral and the air shifts. You feel it when you touch stone carved hundreds of years ago and it feels warm. You feel it when you dream of places you've never been, but know intimately. You feel it when you pause, just for a moment, and hear the hum beneath the silence. That hum, that is Tartaria, still here, still waiting, still singing its song. Not through ruins, not through records, but through resonance. Through you. At this stage in the journey, it becomes difficult to separate Tartaria from ourselves. The more we peel back the layers of forgotten architecture, erased maps, and repressed knowledge, the more we begin to understand that Tartaria was never just about what was built, but about who we were when we built it, and perhaps who we could be again. We started by questioning strange buildings and contradictory timelines, but we arrived somewhere deeper. We found that behind the erased names, beneath the foundations, buried in the soil of forgotten cities, there exists something timeless, not merely ruins but resonance. Not just lost knowledge, but a lost state of being. A world where silence was not emptiness, but space for sacred sound, where architecture was not status, but alignment, where light filtered through colored glass not for beauty alone, but for healing, where towers touched the sky to draw energy down, and water flowed not just for need, but for frequency. Tartaria was not primitive, and it was not magical. It was intentional. And that intention still lives in the geometry we find irresistible, in the way domes feel like shelter from both sky and storm, in the acoustics that lift a whisper into song. We recognize it before we name it. We feel it before we understand it. It is not the past calling, it is something much older, something deeper. So, what happens when you begin to listen again? You begin to see that the disconnection we experience in modern cities is not accidental, it's structural. The rectangular grids, the blank facades, the flickering lights, the unrelenting noise. They don't just overwhelm, they detune. They disrupt natural rhythm. They forget the human body, the planet, the soul. Tartaria didn't forget. Tartaria remembered. And it built that remembrance into everything it made. It's not a coincidence that Tartarian buildings seem to soothe without speaking, that the arches and domes seem to cradle thought, that the materials feel grounded and alive. These weren't luxuries. They were necessities. Tartarian builders weren't just architects, they were translators. They listened to the earth and gave it form. We were never meant to live in cubes, under flickering light, disconnected from the cycles of the sun, the stars, and our own inner resonance. That is why so many are turning away from concrete jungles and sterile systems. That is why the old ways are returning not as rebellion, but as memory. The more we remember Tartaria, the more we realize we are not rebuilding a world that was lost. We are remembering a world that is waiting. As the light of Tartaria begins to glow once more in our collective imagination, it does something rare in historical inquiry. It inspires. Not in the way of nostalgia or fantasy, but in a deeper, more profound way. It inspires us to question what we've accepted, to wonder why we've normalized ugliness, noise, and disconnection, to consider the radical possibility that civilization once moved in harmony with the rhythms of the cosmos and that it can again. Tartaria reminds us that design is not neutral, Every space we enter shapes how we feel, how we think, how we relate to others. Every wall, every ceiling, every street either supports coherence or suppresses it. Tartarian architecture was an architecture of coherence. It didn't dominate. Naturet responded to it. Buildings were oriented to light, to wind, to sound. Cities followed the flow of rivers and hills. Structures were adorned not with excess, but with intention. Every detail mattered. And perhaps what matters most is what they left embedded in the stones. A blueprint, not for control, but for remembrance. You can feel it when you stand inside one of those old buildings. It's like stepping into a different timeline eon, where things moved slower, spoke softer, and resonated deeper. The silence feels intelligent. The space feels alive. This is why Tartaria could never be fully destroyed, because resonance cannot be erased, it only waits. The world that replaced it did so by forgetting, not by improving. And the cracks in that forgetting are now starting to widen. People are waking up with questions in their hearts. Why does this building make me feel something? Why does this city drain me? Why does this forgotten structure feel more like home than the place I live now? We don't need exact names or dates to answer those questions. We need presence. We need awareness. We need to listen again to the places that were built with spirit. To walk not just through cities, but with them. To rebuild not just infrastructure, but intention. Because the return of Tartaria is not about restoring empires. It's about restoring balance. And balance begins with remembering that we are part of the design. Not as rulers, but as resonators. Not as conquerors, but as caretakers. Not as forgetters, but as rememberers. And now we arrive at the quiet end of this long remembering, or perhaps the true beginning. Because the story of Tartaria has never really been about the past. It's always been about something much older and far more present. A thread woven through forgotten architecture, buried timelines, and silent frequencies pulling not toward nostalgia, but toward awakening. An invitation to feel again, to listen again, to remember again. What began with strange maps and half-buried doorways has led us here to a place where history meets spirit, where architecture reveals intention, where vibration carries memory, where the truth isn't locked in museums or archives, but in the soft hum of old buildings, in the geometry of spirals, in the stillness beneath the noise of modern life. Tartaria is not a lost empire to be debated. It is a resonance that lives within us all. Perhaps it always was. Perhaps that's why so many are drawn to it without knowing why. Why a photograph of a long demolished tower stirs emotion. Why an abandoned railway station feels more sacred than a temple. Why a symbol carved into a forgotten wall can bring tears to the eyes. These are not coincidences. They are awakenings, not from sleep, but from forgetting. We are, in many ways, a people rising from amnesia. We have been taught to value speed over silence, control over connection, noise over nuance. But beneath all of that, something gentle endures, something whole, something beautiful, something that once shaped cities and lives and knowledge into one coherent field of living resonance. We called it Tartaria, and though its name was buried, its presence was not. It was encoded in stone. It was layered into the bones of cities. It was hidden in plain sight in water, light, sound, and space, waiting patiently for the world to quiet just enough to hear it again. That time is now. The buildings still whisper, the maps still pulse, the frequencies still hum. And the story, though erased in bookshelves, already been written inside you. Because you are not separate from the forgotten. You are part of what remembers. So walk slowly now, listen deeply, and let the cities speak to you again. Not in words, but in resonance. Not in history, but in harmony. Tartaria is not gone. It is awakening. And so are we. What if Tartaria was never truly lost? What if its memory has been living in us all, along waiting not to be proven, but to be felt? The silence you hear now is not the end of a story. It's the resonance of a truth awakening. You've walked through forgotten cities, touched buried towers, heard the hum of something ancient and whole, not through ruins, but through remembrance. And though the world moved on, something sacred remained. So carry this with you, into your own streets, your own silence, your own stillness, because perhaps the most powerful structures Tartaria ever built are the ones we are just beginning to rebuild inside ourselves. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering.